Hey guys, CS Joseph. Welcome to Cutting Edge with CSJ, September 2020. We're going to be discussing cognitive functions today and debunking some really terrible approaches to cognitive functions. And honestly, this might turn into a rant. I'm not entirely sure. So we'll kind of see how it goes. Okay, so this is titled Misconceptions Concerning Cognitive Functions. All right. So everyone understands, hey, we've talked about each of the individual cognitive functions and their base definitions, right? We've talked about cognitive axis and how they work one another on a particular axis, and we also talked about cognitive orbit, right? So let's just use a few examples. So we have X, and then we have Y, and X equals perception function, right? So X equals perception function, and then Y equals decision-making function, or we'll just say decision function, but it's really a judgment function essentially, right? But then you also have X and then Y, and then you have them in an axis with one another essentially. But then you also have X, and then you have Y as well. But then you have something called orbit, right? And orbit is not something we've talked that much about. It's coming really soon in Season 18. I'm just going to lightly touch it here. But there's just, some different approaches. But then there's a different way to perceive cognitive functions. So I'm going to put their titles here. So we're just going to say definition. There's singular definition right here. So singular, so you guys can understand. And then this is their axis, right? And then this is their orbit. Well, there's actually a fourth thing in here. And I will explain this. So it's two separate things, okay? And we're going to do it this way. We have X, and then you have Y. And then you have Y, and then you have X. Functions, right? So don't forget, the standard mathematical function, which is, f of x, right? Same diff, okay? It's basically the same diff. What does f of x actually really represent? What is a physical way of representing, the function approach to life, basically? Well, it's this thing over here. You draw an S, and then you draw a more different S. I'm quoting, homestarrunner.com, strong bed, never not do strong bed. So we're going to fill in this one here. And we're going to fill in this one here to give it a nice little yin and yang look, okay? So this is a different way than I've typically taught about cognitive functions. But the reason why is because I don't want you guys to think so much about ethics and morals and logic and rationale and metaphysics, or prescience. I don't want you to think in those terms. I really, really don't, because I think that there's something being lost in translation with people when they're considering cognitive functions. It's because they don't understand combining or combinations. There's also cognitive downshifting as well, which is a fifth interpretation of the cognitive functions, which we will also look at. So check this out. We'll look at downshifting right here. So this is we're calling this combining or combinations, cognitive combinations, basically. So this is what this model is here. But if we're going to separate this, if we're going to separate this out, let's look at this. check this approach out, this way to interpret it. Yeah, guys, we're getting super, like, mathematical here with this, okay? Check this out. X of x. Ooh, wait a minute. Now it's getting really complicated. Y of y, okay? And this is a really funny term called downshifting. I cannot take the credit for downshifting. This actually came from my mentor. It's his idea, and I came to realize that it was correct. So this comes from my Chase's ESTP mentor, and Mr. Robert Bryant, good man, Robert Bryant, and so yeah, my ESTP mentor, he came up with cognitive downshifting, and so basically, these are essentially the 5 ways to interpret, cognitive functions. Well, there's technically a 6th, but that 6th one is a little bit different. Okay, so it's not. There's something called like cognitive pairing, which is something else. So let's look at pairing down here. But this is kind of like the odd man out. Okay, it's the odd man out, and pairing is basically when you can have, let's see here. Let's go back in here. So you can have x of y, and you can, and then you have plus y of x equals something, and then you could also have y of x plus y of y equals something, and then you could also do x of x equals or plus, excuse me, y of y in that approach could also equal something else. And it's like, okay, well, wait a minute, what goes here? What's this? So this is known as cognitive pairing. And what is an example of cognitive pairing? Okay, so this is where you get people talking about like the demonic child, okay? The demonic child, right? They get the demonic child. It's when the demon function and the child function team up, basically. Another word for cognitive pairing is known as cognitive teaming, okay? Cognitive teaming, that's another way of this. And I'm probably going to expand a lot more on this in Season 18 because people just don't get it. They don't get it. And I'll admit, in some cases, I kind of don't get it either because just when you think you've learned, all the cognitive functions and what they're capable of doing mechanically, you come to find out that there's actually this other thing that you completely overlooked the entire time. And it's just been that way ever since the beginning. I mean, I learned singular definition, and then I learned orbit from my mentors. Over time, I discovered axis over time, just kind of on my own. Even though axis actually originally comes from Dr. John Beebe, I come to find out later that, I didn't even realize that was actually his original idea, but it really actually was. He had the idea before I did, but I came up with the idea. I came to that logical conclusion on my own, right? But yeah, like axis, it's in energies and patterns and psychological type, and I had come up with the idea before he even had that book out, but the thing is, though, is that came from his work many, many years prior, so it doesn't matter. I'm not trying to take credit here. And cognitive combinations, a little bit different, and it's super important, and we're probably going to spend the majority of this discussion on the combinations part, maybe a little bit of the downshifting, but I'll explain a little bit further. Right now, you guys are like, wow, this is like a lot of random stuff. Like, how does this even make sense? How does it work, right? Okay, well, that's fine. I know you got questions. It's all good. And we could do that. Okay? So, all right. Trogdor. Yes. Trogdor. So, it's time to just let go of the definitions, guys. You guys got to just understand that the human mind is literally just binary. It's zeros and ones or X's and Y's. That's all it is. It really is. The human brain is an actual machine. It's straight up a machine. Most people don't understand how machine-like it is, but it's actually like really actually a thing. So we're gonna get that fixed for y'all. So cognitive combinations. What are cognitive combinations? Okay, so here's my problem with everyone. My problem is that people think that when they're describing cognitive functions, you have all these people, like sometimes on our Facebook public group, they're like, well, introverted sensing causes this, or introverted intuition causes this. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. Like, it just really frustrates me. Like, people come up with so many individual stereotypical misconceptions about cognitive functions where they're literally assigning specific behaviors of specific people to specific cognitive functions in certain slots. And you can't do that. You can't do that. And don't forget, when you're looking at this model over here that I wrote out for you guys, don't forget you still have 8 slots. Where you have hero, you have parent, you have child, right? Inferior, nemesis, the critic, the trickster. So you still have these slots, right? Well, guess what? Axis, the singular definition, the orbit, the combinations, the downshifting, even the pairing/teaming, all of that still applies in every single individual placement of the cognitive attitudes, right? So this is a lot of data that one person just has to keep track of within their own heads at all times. And our brains are naturally built as these supercomputers to literally keep track of all of this data, as well as all of this cognitive capability within what you have, what you have in your brain. Okay, so all right, so we all know what the singular definition is. Okay, introverted intuition provides willpower. Okay, introverted sensing provides endurance and discipline, right? And then or desires for experiences, right? Whereas introverted intuition is desire to give other people's experiences, right? Like, so there's different approaches. Why? It's because they're on an axis. Okay, so obviously we have NI and then SE, and then we have NE, and then we have SI, right? And those are perception functions on an axis, and we know that they turn on an axis consistently, right? Or you also know that you have an orbit where you have NI, but then you also have NE, right? An orbit. And orbits also turn in a similar way with the axis. The difference is that the axis never breaks out of the ego. The axis is always turning within the ego or within whichever 4 sides of the mind that the axis actually exists mentally. The axis never breaks the barrier into the other sides of the mind. Cognitive orbit, however, does. It does break into the other axes of the mind. And through a combination of using both axis and orbit simultaneously, you're able to do an f of x, which is the xy or yx cognitive combinations for basic behavior. And this is where cognitive behavioral therapy would come into play, because that's what they're analyzing. Because cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, literally is just an analysis of nurture, right? And trying to provide good nurture to create good nurture. Plus nurture equals plus nurture in the person, right? It's like this whole garbage point of view of monkey see, monkey do. That's cognitive behavioral therapy. And they're completely ignoring the fact that cognitive combinations has everything to do with that, right? So this is like... this is just how like the axes, work, and then you have orbits. So why is this important? So if you guys have been watching the parenting lectures, right, the best example that I've offered publicly to people in terms of cognitive orbit in my work is saying, hey, when your kid reaches adolescence, you need to stop raising them and start teaching them. But how do you teach a teenage child that's your kid. Like, how do you actually do that, right? Well, the thing is that you have to look at what your outcome is. What is the object of the game when you're using cognitive orbit, when you're teaching a child? Okay, so first, in their childhood, you want to focus on developing their inferior function, okay? That's fantastic. Keep doing that. But then when they hit adolescence, like 12, 13 years old, then it doesn't matter. It's especially bad for girls because they're getting their periods a lot sooner. And as soon as your daughter has her period, she's basically an adolescent at that point, even if she's a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old. You see what I'm saying? Because her hormones are that jacked that she ends up having her period sooner, right? So it's a serious thing, and based on that, like, you guys just got to realize that, when they hit adolescence, the door's closed. They themselves, within their own ego, because their ego is developed enough, have to focus on developing their own inferior function. But it's time at that, because they're an adolescent, that their parent function is waking up. Why? Because remember, guys, and this is relevant. Remember that the order of the functions develop, okay? Remember what the order is, okay? The hero develops first, okay? Then the child. Why? Because they are both primary functions. They are both primary function, also known as optimistic functions, okay? They are optimistic functions. But then afterwards, the inferior function develops next because it's on an axis with the hero, within the ego, okay? And developing, so when your child is born, okay, and they're growing up, they're just like, they still have the functions here, but they're so undeveloped, the only thing that's remotely developed is like their hero function. And when they're growing up to get to 5 years old, it's like hero function, hero function, hero function, hero function. And then they start behaving like a child, and that's like the terrible 2s, right? And the terrible 3s. That's boom. That's the child function is in place. You know what I'm saying? There's a child function. Ooh, there it is. And that's when they're acting like super mega mature and whatnot. But then you gotta, as a parent, they're not gonna start developing this really low frames per second pessimistic function, right? This is a pessimistic function, but it's a secondary function, so it's an S-P, so it's a secondary function that is pessimistic, right? Versus a primary function, which is optimistic, right? Okay? And then they have this secondary function, it's a pessimistic function. So literally, when it comes to Jungian parenting, how you parent a child is that you have to raise them first. Raising means, because they will develop their hero and their child functions on their own, but they need external nurtural factors coming into play to develop their inferior function. So that you as parents, it's your responsibility to help them develop their inferior function. But then when they hit adolescence, their ego has practically reached its potential. You can't develop the inferior function anymore because at that point, the rest of the functions are starting to take care of the inferior function. And whatever inferior function development you invested in your child, that's fantastic. They'll carry it on into adulthood, right? And it's their responsibility. It's your child's own responsibility to develop their inferior function at that point. Fantastic. Now we're in adolescence. And then it becomes teaching. The problem is you cannot focus on making an adolescent responsible enough to develop their parent function. Parent function is where ultimately the completion of the parent function means the ego is fully grown, which means once the ego is fully grown, then they're able to take personal responsibility and be personally responsible for themselves and 100% independent of their parents, okay? This only happens when the parent function is starting the process or midway through or even completely done developing. The problem is, though, is that given the nature of teenagers, you as a parent can't just expect your teenager to be more responsible. In fact, that's irresponsible for you as a parent. So you have to teach them. Growing their inferior function, that's raising your child. Growing their parent function, that's teaching your child. We've been discussing this consistently in season 23, right? Well, here's the issue. Cognitive orbit dictates that since I can't directly impact the parent, I have to impact the parent in a different way. So what I do is I go down to their shadow and I consult with the critic. Because the critic is starting to develop too at this point, And it's like, this is where a person's wisdom, this is where your adolescent teenager's wisdom is supposed to exist. So you end up attacking their critic function and asking your teenager, let's say they were an ESTJ or an ESFJ, and you go up to this ESJ teenager and you're like, okay, is it wise for you to be performing so badly in school? Like, asking that question engages their critic function, which sends a feedback message all the way back up to their ego, to their parent function, and it starts growing their parent function. If I was to go up to an ESTJ adolescent and tell them, hey, you're not doing your duty, you're very irresponsible, you better do your duty, they're just going to tell me to F off. It's not going to do anything. But when I attack their critic function instead, it causes their parent function all of a sudden to be opening to doing their own duty and actually listening. Right? It's like a cat's paw. You attack the critic to get the parent to wake up, because the parent is still subservient to the critic in some capacity. Right? So because of that, this is known as cognitive orbit. This is another way to interpret cognitive functions, cognitive orbit. And I'm going to go much more deeper on this in Season 18 as we continue on. But then we get to the amazing cognitive combinations, which literally no one ever talks about. And it's super frustrating. This is like what I'm so frustrated about. It's really annoying. Why? Well, because people think that certain behaviors are directly linked to X or Y. They think, all of your perceptions are linked to X. They think all of your decisions are linked to Y. No, they're not. Yes, they're decision-making functions. Yes, they are perception functions. That's fantastic. But what do these functions actually accomplish by themselves? Nothing. Nothing. A cognitive function cannot accomplish anything by itself. And I'm growing really tired within the CSJ community seeing how everyone is blaming certain behaviors or certain things on individual functions. And it's not. It's not a thing. It's really not a thing, guys. Because you can't make a decision without information. You can't find information unless you make a decision. It's a literal primary, secondary axis, okay? It's yin and yang, okay? Look at this. Look at this, guys, right here, right here. Look at this. See this big X right here? That's the yang. See this little Y right here? That's the yin version of that Y, right? Or here's the yang version of this Y, and here's the yin version of this X. It's all about primary and secondary. You see what I'm saying? Primary and secondary. Everything is primary and secondary. You can actually take this line of thinking to every aspect of cognition. The four sides of the mind. Which ones are primary? Which ones are secondary? Which functions, individual functions, are primary and secondary? Which axes are primary and secondary? Which orbits are primary and secondary? The yin and the yang are present in all aspects of cognition. This even includes like male versus female. And so many times people are like saying, okay, yeah, there's certain cognitive functions that have male or female traits, right? That have masculine or feminine traits. And it's like, okay, yeah, just because an individual function has a masculine or feminine trait doesn't mean the entire ego is not going to be feminine. You see what I'm saying? Doesn't necessarily mean that. Okay? That's correct, Marcelino. That's correct. People end up judging a person's intelligence by which slot their TI is in, and that's completely irresponsible. It's also ignorant. Don't do it. It's not really how it is. It's about combinations. It's about your neural pathways being developed enough to use the maximum amount of combinations. And combinations is just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is downshifting. I could take my NE hero and pretend it's an NE inferior and act like an NE inferior. Right? That's what cognitive downshifting means, right? So I'll write that down so you guys can see. That's when NE hero equals NE child, temporarily, okay? Or any other function thereof. Cognitive downshifting, a lot of people do it, but they don't even realize that they're doing it. Okay? And this is why it's super, super hard to type people on individual cognitive functions. Oh! Because it's ludicrous. Because you can't do it. Because you cannot gather information with a perception function unless you first made the decision in your mind to start gathering said information. Or you cannot make a single decision unless you have information from which to make a decision. It's both simultaneously in perfect yin and yang equilibrium inside of our minds. An absolute engine that is able to produce a result. Okay? This is literally where it comes from. This is why it's important. But a lot of people don't get this. They don't understand this. So they end up getting super mega judgmental to like everybody around them and saying, well, oh, that guy's obviously an SI user because he's doing this, or, oh, that person abandoned that okay, like, wow, that guy's obviously an SI child because he abandoned that SE hero woman. I'm like, no. He could have been an NI user. NI users have so low SI, where's the loyalty? But even then, it could be an SI critic. And let me tell you, folks, ISPs, when their SI critic is really well developed and they're wise, they're actually super loyal. In fact, they're probably more loyal than other SI users. See, we can't be making judgments about people based on these bullshit misconceptions about how the cognitive functions actually work. And it's so ridiculous. Yes, thank you, Jay. It is the reason for the type grid. We cannot rely on cognitive functions specifically because of the type grid. Because if you look at this, let's imagine that all of these things were good enough for the type grid. There's a reason why I don't use cognitive orbit, downshifting, or combinations, or even teaming or pairing specifically for as a vector to use the type grid. It's just not, it's so subjective, okay? It's very subjective because you just don't know a person's, all of this is objective, but it becomes subjective because there's too many variables to keep track of. And because there's too many variables to keep track of, it becomes rational. It becomes subjective, okay? And because it becomes subjective, it's impossible to use that as a string of logic in the form of a vector to utilize the abacus, that is the type grid, to get a 100% accurate result. You can't do that. You can't even do that with the singular definition of the functions. And everybody is trying to do that all the time. Even some YouTubers out there who are pro CSJ and know the type grid and know the functions, and they're putting up videos and whatnot, and they themselves are making the same exact mistake because they are relying way too much on the functions and their singular definitions. Or because it's too simple. It's too simple, guys. The singular definitions are too simple. Again, you cannot make a decision without information. You cannot get information without making a decision. That's reality. So therefore, the only thing out of these different, approaches to cognitive functions that exist, the only thing here that can be utilized to identify someone's type consistently is cognitive axis. It's the only thing. It's the only thing objective enough to qualify as a vector in using the type grid to identify somebody. Now, granted, we could turn all these other things, singular definitions, combinations, downshifting, pairing, etc. We could turn these things into objective, but we'd have to have an amazing AI system that's analyzing what people say constantly at all times and gathering so many different variables and data points at all times around a person to be able to draw a conclusion that's 100% accurate using the type grid. Okay, yes, sure, it is technically possible. But it could take lifetimes, or maybe a lifetime or half a lifetime, to be able to code all of that, right? It's so interesting. But Axis is the only one that's objective enough because you know if one function is present, the other function is present with it. You always have that law. You always have that. Now, you could use orbit, but only after you've established axis. Because if you can see where their axis is behaving, you know where their orbits are, and you can use orbit to identify, like, for example, their shadow, or do a reverse check towards their ego. So yes, technically, orbit is objective enough to be used in a type grid, but why bother if you already have axis? It doesn't matter. It's redundant at that point. It's completely redundant. This is one of the reasons why I haven't spent so much time on orbit with people, because it's redundant information. And if you think about it, cognitive axis is a prerequisite to cognitive orbit, such that cognitive orbit, it's redundant, it's superfluous. You don't have to know about it to identify somebody's type, because you'd have to know cognitive axis first. But cognitive axis already tells you all the information and helps you identify what quadra they're in by default. So why? You know? So there's all these different things. Now, let's go back to combinations, okay? Combinations. The rule is you can't gather information without making a decision, and you can't make a decision without gathering information. You have to have both. You have to have the yin and yang. You have to have the primary and secondary at all times. You have to have the x of y. You have to have the x of x. You have to have the y of x. You have to have the y of y. You have to have that, okay, in order to do anything, in order to behave in any way, shape, or form, okay? Now, when people are, because here's the reality. We cannot do things with functions by themselves. You can't. It is physically, mentally, cognitively impossible for you to do an action of any kind. It could be a decision or a perception. It doesn't matter. It is impossible to do that with a function by itself. You can't. You can't do that. That function is either interacting directly with the axis, what's on its axis. It's interacting directly with what's on its orbit. It's interacting with a combination, such as when your hero and your parent function combine together. It's always combining with something. It has to be used in combination 100% of the time with other functions. All we're trying to do is just identify which functions are used primarily and then which functions are in the secondary roles. Everyone just thinks it's this bullshit static thing. No, guys, it's not. It's not static at all, okay? Seriously. Okay, static functions, right? LOL. Static functions? No, this is bullshit. No. There is dynamic functions. Dynamics. This is why I called this the four sides dynamics. Dynamic functions, all right? So when you look at, let's say, you have NI hero, right? And then you have SE inferior, right? Okay? Well, then what if you have SE hero and then you have NI inferior, right? What this basically means is you have primary and you have secondary. You have primary and you have secondary. You see what I'm saying, guys? And that's just with functions on their axis, right? What happens when I do something like this? This will really spin your noodle. When I have TI parent as my primary role, right? And then what happens when I have, guess what? My any hero, and I'm forcing it through cognitive downshifting or whatever else to be in a secondary role. What are you guys going to do then, huh? How are you actually going to know which function's being used, huh? See, you can't. You can't. It's impossible. This is why we have to rely on interaction styles and temperaments, using axis analysis as a separate piece on its own. Quadra identification, which guess what? If you're successfully able to complete all of axis analysis, you automatically know what quadra they're in. Quadra is almost even like a prerequisite in of its own right, or axis is a prerequisite of quadra, which is technically redundant information if you think about it. Because if you do two axes, if you match two axes, you get a quadra, right? So yeah, cognitive functions are far more complicated than what people think. And you get people out there who put so much effort into understanding static functions, and they completely ignore the truth, which is dynamic functions. They completely ignore that. Your functions are constantly like this endless chemical reaction where they're going in and out of each other, and they're spinning around and trading electrons and trading protons, because they're like these different atomic masses inside of your soul moving together like a solar system and trading energy and moving energy around constantly, that you can't literally say, oh, that guy's just got SI parent. You know, it doesn't even make sense. It's bullshit. You can't do this, okay? So understand, like, no. So at all things Jungian analytical psychology, you have to look at it in terms of dynamics. You have to look at it in terms of primary versus secondary. You have to look at it in terms of yin and yang. If you're not looking at it in terms of yin and yang, you will never reach the understanding that you need with functions. And the yin and yang doesn't apply to just functions. It applies to the four sides of your mind. It applies to the feminine, the masculine components of your ego. It also applies to the feminine, the masculine components of the individual functions. Right? It really does. It really, really does. Okay? So a lot of people don't understand that concept. Okay? So, especially when you're looking at, like, because you're always looking at something from a lens, okay? You got to look at it this way, like a microscope, right? And you have different lenses that you can look at things with a microscope. One day you're using your NI lens, and then it's like, well, I want to look at my SE lens, so you add the SE lens. Or I want to get rid of my NI lens and just use an SE lens, but then I have to put my little NI lens in front of it. You know what I'm saying? It's all what are the order of the lenses? What if you're using a decision-making lens with a perception lens at the same time? What's happening then? You know? So this is absolutely ridiculous to me. I don't understand how people can walk around thinking that they understand, like, that they know that they're the end-all be-all authority of this science when they're not even considering the dynamic components that are required to even achieve cognition to begin with. So I'm going to show you guys a little chart to kind of help you make sense of all this. It's a cool chart. Perception functions, decision-making functions. You know what? I'll just write it out, because why not? Perception versus decision. Okay. All right. Right? And then you have primary, then you have secondary. Primary, secondary role. So the primary role, the secondary role. Okay? All right. So on an axis, we're going to use... let's use expert intuition, okay? Expert intuition is the primary role. Introverted sensing is the secondary role. But with decision making, what's the primary? Okay? Well, sometimes, because I have FI child and it's optimistic, sometimes, guess what? It ends up being in the primary role, right? And sometimes, because that happens, my TI ends up getting thrown to the wind and it becomes a secondary role. I'm still an ENTP, but perception versus decision versus primary versus secondary. Guys, this chart right here is how you understand f of x functions, right? Y of y, x of y, x of x, y of y in terms of cognitive combinations. Because guess what? This is kind of like game theory. You guys ever hear about game theory? It's called Governing Dynamics by John Nash. This is Jungian governing dynamics right here. Okay, so Jungian game theory. Okay, Jungian game theory is literally these little games that our functions play inside of our heads. Okay, also known as governing dynamics. Okay, super important. All right. And every function gets one turn, and they choose their role and whatnot. And then basically, guess what? This equals an outcome. This is an outcome. The outcome could be, it could be a perception. It could be a perception. It could be, and then a decision. Could be the outcome. Or it could be a decision that is led as a result of the perception. Don't forget, guys. Don't forget. You cannot make a decision without gathering information. You cannot gather information unless you make a decision. Those are two outcomes, okay? Two outcomes that are possible. So I'm going to make this a little bit easier. Okay? It's two outcomes. So, all right. So I'm going to do gather info, which is perceiving to make decision. Okay? All right. Well, let's analyze this a little bit. Gather info. That's perception. Okay, to make decision. Make decision. Okay, that's judgment, right? Okay. Then you go beyond that. You have make decision to gather info. Okay. And then making decision is a judgment. Okay. And then beyond that, you have a perception. Okay. So these are known as the two cognitive outcomes. Okay. Two cognitive outcomes. Right? And one of them is chosen. Okay? And then, guess what the final result is? Equals, because equal signs for me are also arrows, equals action. Okay? So we've just walked you through the entire process of how the brain takes an action in a human being. And it literally is the brain taking the cognitive functions within an ego, and this box, guess what? This box is literally just the ego box. It's the ego box. There's still a shadow box down here that's also interacting. I haven't talked about that, but you can kind of intuitively, with your logic, figure out what's in the shadow box, or what's in the sub box, or what's in the superego box. There's boxes, okay? So this model here with the functions, they are interacting. Because if you choose to put a function, a perception function, or a decision-making function in a primary role, whatever you choose, because you have two choices, okay? You have to make this choice, and you have to make this choice, okay? What am I putting in my primary or there? Or sometimes maybe you have this choice. Maybe you're actually choosing to take a secondary role in a particular moment. An example of that would be a woman being respectful and deferential to her husband, for example, right? With her decision-making, perhaps, right? She's taking on a secondary feminine role, whereas primary masculine role. That's not to mention that women can use primary masculine role functions in their heads, right? Because as soon as you make a decision to put a function into any of those 4 boxes, the rest of the boxes in your head are filled out. If you commit to one, and you have to commit to 2, once you commit to both, then you have all 16 boxes filled, and then the outcome is either gather info to make a decision, or make a decision to gather info, which translates to an actual action. Gentlemen, this is, and ladies, this is cognitive combinations. Don't you tell me that anyone out there actually understands cognitive functions such a way where they can tell me a specific behavior absolutely means TI child, or SI inferior, or TE child, or TE parent. Come on. They're either ignorant or they're arrogant. That's not how it works. And I'm so tired of this. So tired of this. A lot of people just don't freaking get this. And it's so frustrating. Okay? This is Jungian game theory. This is Jungian governing dynamics. This is literally what's going on in our heads at all times. This is cognitive combining. This is cognitive combinations. Okay? Because literally our brains are trying to reach 2 outcomes at all times to be able to create an action. Okay? So the end result is the action. And to get to that action, there needs to be 2 outcomes. And those are the outcomes. But you can only arrive at those outcomes when you have this grid of 16 boxes where your 16 cognitive functions technically are in their primary and their secondary states, separated between perception and decision. This is literally how it works. And if you don't understand that, well, then you're a charlatan. And yet, tells me I'm a charlatan all the time. Or whatever. Come on. Well, they don't even know what they're talking. They don't know, like, about this stuff. Okay? I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying, like, stop being so judgmental. That's all I'm saying. Do you guys, like, even understand where this is supposed to come into play? Yeah, everyone's relying so much on singular definitions, and as soon as you start talking about things outside of the singular definitions of the cognitive functions, guess what? You're shat on. You're persecuted. Oh, you're different. Or you're real too fringe. Oh, you're a charlatan. And they just start labeling you, and it's just like, why? Why? Okay? This is literally like reverse engineering human action directly of looking at how combinations of cognitive functions actually combine. You know? And yeah, cognitive placement, it's not so difficult to... So if you have any questions, now's the time. We'll give a few minutes for a small Q&A about the content relating to this specific presentation, and then we'll call it a night. So, any questions? Hashtag wait for questions. Can I draw out the other 3 boxes? I really don't want to, but it's pretty easy. Just treat the boxes kind of like their own little type grid or whatever. And that's literally how people arrive to a decision. And I'll also talk a little bit more about cognitive downshifting. But cognitive downshifting combined with combinations, it's really how you can understand how Jungian governing dynamics works when you're using these boxes and assigning cognitive functions in certain places, etc. Because remember, it's about axis, and Axis primary, axis secondary, but also perception, decision, etc. So if you're choosing a primary role for any, automatically SI is in the secondary role, etc. So, for perception, think about it that way. So hopefully that makes sense. I have no idea where my phone is. Okay. I am phoneless. No, I'm not. I found it. Okay. Okay, but the shadow functions are all pessimistic, right? No, Marcelino. No, they're not. The shadow functions are not all pessimistic. Remember, 4 sides of the mind. Your ego itself is optimistic. At the layer of the 4 sides of the mind. So imagine 4 sides of the mind on a layer. On that layer, the ego is optimistic, and the shadow or the unconscious is pessimistic. However, if you go down the one layer to the level of the individual functions, those individual functions, the hero is optimistic, but the parent is pessimistic. The child is optimistic. The inferior is pessimistic. The nemesis in the unconscious is actually optimistic, even though it's within a pessimistic side of the mind. So that means if you look at the primary role of the ego, this has a positive charge to it. But if you're going to look at the NI nemesis down here in this box, right, it will have a positive charge because it's an optimistic function, but it will have a negative charge because it's in the pessimistic side of the mind. Don't you get it? Don't you see now? It's different layers. It's another form of x of x and y of x and x of y and y of y. Okay? All right. Anthrax. Barb, if you were to draw out the other boxes, do the primary always remain positive and the secondary pessimistic roles? Not necessarily, no. Not necessarily. The answer is not necessarily. That can change. That could change. I could primarily decide to use a secondary function, and I'm taking on a secondary role, right? A yin role, right? Okay. Is there a way to get the functions to readjust with an SE experience when the person is projecting other functions? You're going to have to elaborate on that, Anthrax. James Morgan. So even if you have confirmed someone's type, you're saying still don't attack certain functions. I am saying attack certain functions because social engineering is when someone else is putting functions in your boxes, basically. Putting your functions in your boxes for you and deciding for you. That's what social engineering is. You're literally controlling another person's cognitive combinations because you're influencing their cognitive functions. And they can resist you and keep the functions in the boxes that they want, or they can decide to not resist you and then allow you to dictate what functions go into what box. It's kind of like when an INTJ and an INFJ decide to have sex. One of them has to pretend to be the ENP. You see what I'm saying? Like, I know you're an ENFP, so you might have SI inferior depravity, so let's attack that. It still is, but that's not the direction. Does that make the nemesis function neutral? No, it doesn't. Again, it's like how many electrons or protons does it have in an atomic system? Is it trading electrons? Is it trading protons with other atoms? No. Yeah, like dynamic nature means type is not a confining box. It has a default state to it, but it changes over time based on neutral influences, external or internal influences. It changes. Okay? Marcelino, so then would the functions in your subconscious have an extra positive charge since you're aspiring? Yes, it could potentially. You could also still have a negative charge if you're giving into your insecurity going through that gateway. So yes. Anthrax. Okay, if you attempt a criticism on someone, they will respond by activating a parent function or a critic. That's up to them. If they want to respond by cognitive axis, or if they want to respond by cognitive orbit, they can. Or if they want to actually use a combination, which could be potentially a little bit more difficult. It's like you're playing Killer Instinct, right? And you're fighting Cinder, and Cinder's got some basic moves that he does, but eventually Cinder's going to wind up and nail you with a combo. Okay, Cinder's going to use a couple of his singular punches. That's singular cognitive definition. And then he's going to use the 1-2 punch, and that's his cognitive axis. And then he's going to use orbit, where he's using a punch and a kick. And then he gets to the combinations, and then he starts to use a combo, and you're getting hit like 8 to 16 times, and then all of a sudden you're done, right? Or if you're a good social engineer, when you're in this fight against Cinder and Killer Instinct, you start doing the single hits, and then 1-2 punch with your axis, and then punch kick with your orbit, and then you're gonna hit him with your combination, and then it's like combo breaker. You see what I'm saying? That's literally how it works, just mentally in our heads. Hopefully that was a better way of looking at it, right? Okay. Okay. Is it guaranteed that they will respond in this fashion? It's guaranteed that they will respond in any fashion that's available to their mind, but they will not respond in a fashion that is not available to their mind. They will respond in ways that are likely or easier for them to respond with their mind, and they will not respond to the things that is not likely for them to, like unlikely for them to respond with as well. Okay? Okay? I literally just explained cognitive combat to you guys too, like, social engineering and external, internal, through that. That's like worth an entire lecture of its own right. You got a freebie out of me on that one. What would it look like if someone had an underdeveloped parent function? Literally what it looks like right now. Because this is an ENTP in these boxes, right? And they're using their FE child to be in the primary role, when the reality of the situation is it shouldn't even be this way. What default should be when they're completely, properly handled, it should be this. It should be this way, right? Being in the secondary role. But oftentimes because, it's not, people have them switched because they don't have their parent function developed enough to put it in the primary role of decision making. Instead, they just lean on their FE child instead. So, yeah. Make the video anyway. Marcelino. So then the functions in your superego could also have a positive or negative charge depending on the nature of the transition. Yes, of course. But that's heavily discussed in season 19. Depending on how well developed your the parent functions, each within of the 4 sides of your mind are, right? Okay? So, I could literally make a grid of all the 16 types, and I could show you so many different combinations of each of these, the 16 box grids with each of their 16 cognitive functions based on the 4 sides of the mind, and literally walk you through their entire developmental life and where they are at their different life stages just based on these little charts, and you can see where they are, what functions are going into what role based on perception and decision, and who's going where and what. And then you could even actually, this is how you break down the human soul, human actions, basically, into pure mathematics. And then you could actually program an AI system to mathematically deduce what's the best way to ego hack the particular subject at the moment. This is the end for this Journeyman lecture, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. journeyman cutting edge at CSJ. Yeah, a lot of people just don't understand. Yeah. So we're going to rename this, I think, Misconceptions Concerning Cognitive Functions. So anyway, folks, thank you all for your questions, and thank you all for coming. Love you all, and thank you. Very much appreciate it. Oh, James Morgan, real quick. With the whole primary versus secondary, doesn't FE soften the blow of the TI sort of truth? Yeah, in that particular situation, it just depends on what the ENTP is trying to do. It just really depends what the ENTP is trying to do. The ENTP or anybody gets to decide which functions go in what boxes. And sometimes they're afraid of deciding which functions go into which boxes because they don't know what outcome they're going to get. They're afraid of what action is going to be produced and then the consequences of that action down here, because every action has consequences, right? And sometimes people are not aware of the consequences. Maybe they're hyper aware of the consequences. That could be a problem, right? So awareness also dictates too, right? So, yeah, sure thing, Marcelino. Anywho, folks, I got to get going. Thank you all for being here, and it's been fantastic. And I'll see you guys next month for Cutting Edge with CSJ, October 2020. Have a good night, folks.